What is up, guys? My name is Jonathan, and in this video we're going to be talking about the DOM and how you can manipulate it using JavaScript. Now, before I show you how to manipulate the DOM, we first have to understand what it is. DOM stands for Document Object Model. This might sound intimidating at first, but it's actually quite simple. We'll use this basic HTML as a way for us to help understand what a document object model is. The document is basically all of the code in this file. And the document is this file. The document is index.html. And the objects are all of the elements within this HTML code. In our case, we have HTML, head, meta, title, body, and header 1. All of these elements are considered objects in the eyes of the DOM. Now, the model is the way in which these objects are structured. So, for example, meta and title are structured in a way that they're inside of the head, and they have a parent and child relationship. For example, the head element would be a parent of meta and title, and meta and title will be a child of head. And similarly, heading 1 will be a child of body, and body will be a parent of heading 1. To get a better idea of this, let's move on over to our browser. So I have this file opened up right here, index.html, and I'm going to right click and click on Inspect. This will open up the Google Chrome Developer Tools, and we want to switch to the Console tab. If you're not familiar with the Console tab, it's just a way of executing JavaScript code on the browser. And in JavaScript, there's a special keyword called document that is used to reference our document object model. I can actually log it right here real quick. Console.log document, and it returns an object that looks basically like our code in this file. And each of these elements are structured in a way that make up our model. That's the structure of a DOM. And this is really important because the structure of a DOM gives programming languages like JavaScript an idea of how to talk to them and thus modify the HTML elements within them. That, in a nutshell, is what the document object model is. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about how we can manipulate the DOM using JavaScript. So I'm going to clean up real quick, and there are a lot of ways that we can manipulate the DOM, but in this video we're going to cover just the common use cases. The first one we're going over is how we can create an element and append it to the DOM. So the first thing we're going to do is create an element. I'm going to create a paragraph element and assign it to a variable called para. We're going to use our keyword document and use a method called createElement. And in here we're going to pass in a string of p for paragraph. If we wanted to create a div element, we can do div. If we wanted to create an anchor element, we can do a. But in this case, we're just going to stick with a paragraph. Now, if we log this, you can actually see that there are two paragraph tag, or an opening paragraph tag and a closing paragraph tag, but notice that there's no text in between them. To insert text in a paragraph element or any type of element, we need to create something called a text node. So we can do that by creating a variable called text and using our keyword and using a method called createTextNode. And in here we can pass in our desired text. I'm just going to write, this is a paragraph. And if we log that, we can see that it just returns a string representation of our text. So our goal is to insert this text into these p tags. And we can do that by appending this text node to our paragraph element, simply by using para dot and using a method called append child. And we're going to pass in our variable text. So what this is doing is it will append text, our text node, to our paragraph element. And if I log our paragraph element, you can now see that it has text inside of it. Our next goal is to actually append it to our DOM. So to do that, we need to append it to a pre-existing element within our HTML code. So we're going to use the body in this case. We want to create an element, a variable, and I'm going to name it body, and simply all we need to type is document.body to retrieve the body of our DOM. And if we log this, we can see that we have our body with all of the child elements included. So similarly to how we appended our text node to our paragraph element, we want to append our paragraph element to our body. So we can do that by using body.append child and pass in our paragraph element. And you can see that it's been added to our DOM and is being reflected to in our browser. If we log our body, you can also see that we have a new element. Our paragraph element has been added as the last element last child element within our body. So that's how we can create an element and append it to our DOM. Now before we move on to the next one, it's important to note that any changes made to the DOM using JavaScript are only present during the runtime of the application. For example, if I create an element like I just did, I created the paragraph element and appended it to the body, it'll only be here until I refresh the page, like so. And this is because when manipulating the DOM, it doesn't actually change our HTML code here. It changes it in memory. It changes the HTML code that is loaded up by the browser and into our DOM. So when refreshing the page, the browser loads the web page using our HTML code in this file, which does not have our paragraph element. And that's why it disappears. So that's something to keep in mind when you're modifying the DOM with JavaScript. Okay, the next thing we're going to cover is how we can delete an element from our DOM. In this case, we're going to delete, this is the header, this h1 element here. And to make things easier, I'm going to add an ID to this so we can easily reference it. And we're just going to call it my header. And save and refresh. Now, if we want to grab my header and assign it to this variable, we can do document dot and use a method called getElementById, which does exactly what it sounds like. It gets this element by its ID. So if we put in my header, enter, and if we log that, we can see that we have our header. And just putting my cursor over it, you can see that it's being highlighted in the browser. Now to remove this header, it's actually quite simple. All we have to do is reference our variable and use a method called remove. And once we remove that, we can see it being removed from our DOM and therefore no longer showing up in our browser. Like I said before, if we refresh this page, then it'll reload this and the header will be back. just like that. So the next thing I want to go over is modifying an element's value. And to better demonstrate this, I'm going to create a new HTML element of input, type text with a value of hello and an ID of my input, and save that. And you can see my input right here with a value of hello. Now the first thing we want to do, just like in our previous example, is grab our input. I'm going to create a variable called input and use our document.getElementById method. And in our case right here, in this case, it's going to be my input. And if we log this, we can see our input. And we want to change our value so that instead of hello, it says maybe something like goodbye. So we can access our value property by using input.value and reassigning it to a different value. I'm going to choose goodbye. And now you can see that it's been changed in the DOM and therefore shows goodbye now instead of hello in the browser. And that's how you change a element's value using JavaScript. The next thing we're going to do is change this element's style. So this one is very similar. We can do input.style and right here we can choose the type of style we want to change. For simplicity, I'm going to change just the background color. And we are going to make this red. And there you have it. Red background. There's obviously a lot more styles you can change using this method, but that's all I'm going to cover for now. Actually, why not? We'll do one more. We can do a border. We'll do a border. And that's equal to, let's say, 10 pixels, solid blue. There we go. Now it has a 10 pixel solid blue border around the input. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is add and remove classes from an element. So if I log our input right now, you can see that there are no classes here. We have a type, value, ID, and style, but no class. To add a class, we simply do input.classlist.add, which is a method, and in here we will pass in the class that we want to add. I'm going to simply do class 1, and if we relog that, we can see that class 1, or it has a class of class 1 now, whereas before it had no class at all. And you can actually add more than one class, so I can add class 3. And you can see now we have this element has class 1 and class 3. And removing an element is really simple. All we have to do is change add to remove. And let's remove class 1. If we log that, we can see that class 1 is no longer here. So that is how you remove and add classes to and from an element. The next thing we're going to cover is how you can change the ID of an element. So we can see right now that our ID is my input. And this is similar to a value, similar to our value example. Instead of value, we will do input.id and reassign it to our new ID. And let's do new ID. And if we console.log that, input, we can see that our ID is now new ID when previously it was my input. And that's how you change an ID of an element. So the next one I'm going to talk about is a little more complex. We're going to be covering how to traverse through the DOM. And to really get an understanding of how this works, we need to first understand the child and parent relationship that I was talking about earlier. Just to recap, this head element is the parent element to this meta and title element, and this meta and title element are child elements to this head. And similarly, the heading 1 and input element are child elements to this body. And this body is a parent element to this H1 and input element. And that's important to know because when you're traversing through the DOM, you're actually traversing through parent and child nodes. For example, with the body element, I am able to traverse through the DOM and get the input element. And I can show you this more in detail in a second. I'm going to add a couple elements just to help the demonstration run smoother. I'm going to make a paragraph, and that's fine. We're going to save it, and you can see now that we have a div with some dummy text. I'm going to start off with a simple example. We are going to try and retrieve this H1 element while only starting out with this body element. So first off, we need the body. Just like before, I'm going to do document.body to get our DOM's body, and you can console log that and see all of our new elements in here. We got the H1, input, div, and script. This is just something that's been created by my code editor, so you can safely just ignore that. And now we want to try and retrieve H1 while starting out with body and traversing down one level. We're going to create a variable called header1, and that's going to equal the body dot. So we're starting out with the body, and we want the first child. So to get that, we can do first body dot first element child, and that'll get our H1 element. Let's log that and make sure our work is correct. So there we have it. We have the H1 element. So that's a relatively simple use case of traversing the DOM. I've created more nested elements here just to make it a little more complex. And we're going to try to get this paragraph element starting out with the body element this time. So instead of header 1, we are going to get paragraph 1, and that's going to equal body dot. So if we take a look here, we can see that div. We can see that the paragraph is inside div, and div happens to be the third element down. So what we can do is we can get the last element child, which is a script, and we can use previous element sibling, which will be our div. And this currently will return the div, but we want the paragraph tag. So we can go one step further and get the first element child of the div. And this should return our paragraph element. And there we have it. So that is a more complex example of traversing down into the DOM and retrieving a child element. And you can also go in reverse and go from a child element all the way back up to its parent's element. And we can actually do an example of going from the paragraph element back up to the body element. So this time we want the body. Let's just call it bod. And that's going to be equal to our paragraph 1 dot parent element. So currently we are at the div because the div is the parent element of our paragraph element. And we want to go one step further to the body. So we'll just do one more dot parent element, and that should be it. And there we have it. We have the body, and we were able to retrieve it starting from our paragraph element, and we traversed up into our parent and then into the parent of our parent, which happens to be the body. So that's how you traverse through the DOM. That'll do it for me. I hope you guys liked the video, and if you did, please like and subscribe and leave a comment on what you want to see next. I'll see you guys next time.